May 15, 2024. Millfield Academy. Margaret Cross had been watching the security monitors for 3 hours when she saw the first Molotov cocktail sail through the chapel window. 6 expelled students, 12 gallons of gasoline, 1 match. They came back on graduation night like she always knew they would. What she didn't expect was the note slipped under her office door 30 seconds before the first explosion. Your daughter didn't die in an accident, Maggie. Tonight you'll learn who really lit that match. The flames spread faster than physics allowed. Someone had help, someone with keys, someone who knew exactly which walls to hit first. As Margaret ran toward the burning dormitory where Sarah died 15 years ago, she realized the students weren't the real arsonists. They were the distraction. The killer had been waiting, watching, planning. Tonight wasn't about revenge. Tonight was about erasing evidence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The smoke alarm's shriek cut through the night air as Margaret Cross sprinted across the quad, her radio crackling with panicked voices from the skeleton crew still on campus. Behind her, orange light danced against the Gothic windows of Millfield's main hall, casting twisted shadows that seemed to reach for her with fingers of flame. 15 years of security work had taught her to trust her instincts, and every instinct screamed that something was wrong with this picture. The expelled students, she recognized Tommy Brennan's lanky frame silhouetted against the chapel fire, were making too much noise, moving too predictably. Real arsonists didn't announce themselves with Molotov cocktails through stained glass windows. At 11:47 p.m. on graduation night, when half the faculty was still celebrating at the headmaster's reception, her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, Building C basement, 5 minutes. Come alone or lose the truth forever. Margaret's blood turned to ice. Building C was Ashford Hall, Sarah's dormitory. She changed direction, her security master key already in her hand. The note in her office had been printed on Millfield letterhead, the expensive kind reserved for donor correspondence. Whoever wrote it had access to administrative supplies, knew her schedule, and understood exactly which psychological pressure points would make her abandon protocol and chase ghosts into a burning building. The brass key turned smoothly in Ashford's side entrance, too smoothly. The lock mechanism had been oiled recently. Margaret drew her flashlight and stepped inside, immediately hit by the acrid smell of accelerant. Not gasoline, something more sophisticated, something that burned hotter, faster. The basement stairs groaned under her feet as she descended into darkness that seemed to swallow her flashlight beam. She'd been down here countless times during her security rounds, but tonight the familiar space felt foreign, charged with menace. Water pipes dripped overhead in an irregular rhythm that matched her hammering pulse. At the bottom of the stairs she stopped. A section of the concrete wall that should have been solid stood partially open. A hidden door she'd walked past thousands of times without knowing it existed. Warm air flowed from the opening, carrying the distinct scent of old paper and developing chemicals. Margaret stepped through. The hidden room was larger than her office upstairs, lined with metal filing cabinets and corkboards covered in photographs. Her flashlight beam swept across dozens of images of students, some she recognized, others from before her time at Millfield. In the center of the room sat a desk with 3 manila folders laid out precisely, as if someone had been expecting her. The middle folder bore Sarah's name. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Crime scene photos she'd never seen, autopsy reports with sections highlighted in yellow, a floor plan of Sarah's dorm room with measurements and trajectory analyses. But it was the final document that made her knees buckle. A toxicology report showing lethal levels of sedatives in Sarah's blood. Sedatives that would have prevented her from waking up when the fire started. You always were thorough in your investigations, weren't you, Chief Cross? Margaret spun toward the voice. Headmaster William Hayworth stepped into the doorway, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled from the evening's festivities. His bow tie hung loose around his neck, and there was something cold in his eyes she'd never noticed before. 15 years I've been waiting for you to stumble onto this room, he continued, moving closer. Though I must admit, I didn't expect to have to manufacture the circumstances myself. You killed Sarah. The words came out as a whisper. Sarah was going to expose certain Financial irregularities in our scholarship program. Money that needed to disappear to protect very important people. Your daughter was always too curious for her own good. He gestured toward the filing cabinets. Just like you. Margaret's radio crackled. Margaret, where are you? The fire department's here, but they can't find you anywhere. Hayworth smiled and reached into his jacket. The beauty of tonight's chaos is that everyone will assume you died trying to save your precious school. A hero's death, really, much more dignified than what you deserve. The overhead sprinkler system suddenly activated, dousing them both in icy water. But instead of relief, Margaret felt terror. The water wasn't putting out fires, it was washing away evidence, dissolving photographs, destroying documents. Insurance investigates everything except accidental deaths during natural disasters, Hayworth shouted over the sound of rushing water. Amazing what counts as natural when you control the narrative. Margaret lunged for the Sarah folder, but Hayworth was faster. The sedative-laced cloth pressed against her face smelled like sweet almonds and broken promises. As consciousness faded, she heard his voice growing distant. Don't worry, Maggie. You'll finally get to see Sarah again. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was the corkboard of student photographs dissolving in the artificial rain, faces washing away like watercolor tears. The darkness that claimed Margaret Cross was not empty. It carried her back 15 years, to another night when smoke had filled her lungs and sirens wailed across campus like dying angels. In the space between consciousness and void, she was 38 again, standing in her turnout gear outside Ashford Hall, while flames devoured the third-floor windows. She could hear herself screaming Sarah's name over the roar of the fire, could feel the heat peeling paint from the Gothic window frames, could smell the toxic cocktail of burning synthetics and 100-year-old wood. But this time, in the dream memory, she could see into Sarah's room, could see her daughter lying motionless on her narrow dormitory bed while orange fingers crept under the door, could see the empty pill bottle on the nightstand that hadn't been there in any official report. Wake up, Mom, Sarah's voice echoed from somewhere beyond the flames. Wake up and finish what I started. Margaret's eyes snapped open to the sting of chlorinated water and the metallic taste of blood. The hidden room had become a drowning chamber, ankle-deep in water that continued to pour from the overhead sprinklers. Emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red, and the filing cabinets gaped open like mechanical mouths, their contents scattered and dissolving across the concrete floor. Hayworth was gone. So was Sarah's folder. But something had survived the deluge. Margaret's fingers found the edge of a photograph half hidden beneath the desk, one that must have fallen during the struggle. She pulled it free, squinting in the dim light. It showed Sarah at last year's scholarship dinner standing beside a group of donors Margaret didn't recognize. Wealthy-looking people in expensive suits, their smiles sharp and predatory. On the back, someone had written in Sarah's careful handwriting, "Follow the money. Trust no one in admin." The water level was rising. Margaret struggled to her feet, fighting waves of nausea from whatever Hayworth had drugged her with. Her radio was dead, waterlogged and useless. Above her head she could hear new sounds, not the chaotic shouting of firefighters, but the methodical footsteps of someone searching room by room. She thought of Tom Bradley, the night janitor who'd become her closest friend in 15 years of late shifts and quiet conversations. Tom would be looking for her, probably scared out of his mind. He was the only person on staff who remembered how she used to be before Sarah died, back when Margaret Cross was chief of the Millfield Volunteer Fire Department, a woman who ran toward danger instead of spending her nights walking empty hallways like a ghost protecting nothing. Tom had been the one to find her the morning after Sarah's funeral, sitting in her new security office with a bottle of whiskey and her badge from the fire department. He'd taken both away from her without saying a word, made terrible coffee, and listened while she talked about how she'd failed the only person who mattered. Every year since then, he'd brought her a small cake on Sarah's birthday. Every year, she'd pretended not to cry while eating it. If something happened to her tonight, Tom would blame himself. That knowledge cut deeper than any physical pain. Margaret waded toward the hidden door, her waterlogged boots squelching against the concrete. The photographs on the corkboards had become abstract smears of color, but she could still make out fragments, pieces of faces, partial license plates, fragments of documents. How many families had Hayworth destroyed to protect whatever financial scheme Sarah had uncovered? How many students had discovered too much and paid the price? The main basement felt like a cathedral after the claustrophobic hidden room. Margaret pressed herself against the wall beside the stairwell, listening. The footsteps above had stopped, but that didn't mean she was alone. In 15 years of night security, she'd learned to distinguish between the settling sounds of an old building and the presence of humans trying to move quietly. Someone was waiting for her upstairs. She thought about the expelled students who'd started this whole nightmare. Tommy Brennan and his crew were probably in custody by now, confused and angry about being arrested for crimes they'd only partially committed. They'd wanted to hurt the school, yes, but they'd been used, manipulated into creating the perfect cover for murder and evidence destruction, just like she'd been manipulated into coming here alone. Margaret touched the photograph in her pocket, the only physical proof that Sarah had been investigating something worth killing for. The faces in that image were her only lead, but first she had to survive long enough to show them to someone who could help. The irony wasn't lost on her. For 15 years, she'd been protecting a place that had killed her daughter. Now she had to escape it to finally get Sarah justice. Above her, a floorboard creaked. Whoever was hunting her was moving again, and Margaret realized with crystal clarity that her quiet life as a guilt-ridden security guard was over. The woman who climbed these stairs would be someone different, someone willing to fight back, someone Sarah would recognize. Margaret took the first step up the basement stairs, her wet boots silent against the worn wood. The woman who had spent 15 years apologizing for breathing was gone, left drowning in that hidden room with the dissolved evidence of her daughter's murder. What emerged was someone else entirely, someone who remembered what it felt like to kick down doors and pull people from burning buildings. The emergency lighting cast geometric shadows across the stairwell walls, and in their shifting patterns, Margaret saw the truth she'd been too broken to recognize. This had always been about more than one dead girl. Sarah had stumbled onto something vast, something worth killing for and worth destroying a school to hide. The scholarship program irregularities were just the surface. At the top of the stairs, she paused. The basement door stood slightly ajar, and through the gap she could see the main hallway of Ashford Hall stretching toward the lobby. The building's automatic systems had activated. Sprinklers, emergency lighting, fire doors sealed shut. Someone with administrative access had triggered a controlled lockdown, trapping her inside with whoever was hunting her. Margaret eased the door open and stepped into the hallway. The silence was different now, pregnant with anticipation. Whoever was waiting knew she was coming. They wanted her to find them. Her phone vibrated. The screen showed a text from her own number, which was impossible. Her phone was in her pocket. Margaret's blood turned to ice as she read the message, third floor. Sarah's room. Time to finish what we started. Below the text was an attachment, a video file with Sarah's name as the timestamp. Margaret's hands shook as she opened it. The video was grainy, clearly taken with a hidden camera, but the timestamp showed it was recorded the night Sarah died. The image showed Sarah's dorm room, but Sarah wasn't alone. 3 figures stood around her bed. One was clearly Hayworth, younger but unmistakable. The other 2 were harder to make out, but one wore the distinctive jacket of Millfield's maintenance staff. As Margaret watched in horror, she saw Hayworth inject something into Sarah's 4-line while the maintenance worker disabled the smoke detector on the wall. But it was the third figure that made Margaret's world collapse. Standing in the doorway, watching everything with calm approval, was Tom Bradley. Her friend Tom, the man who'd brought her birthday cake every year and listened to her grief, the man she'd trusted with 15 years of guilt and broken memories. The video continued. She watched Sarah's breathing become shallow, watched the 3 men wait exactly 12 minutes before the maintenance worker began spreading accelerant around the room's baseboards. She watched Tom check his watch and nod to the others before they filed out, leaving her daughter to burn alive in a drugged stupor. Margaret's knees hit the hallway floor. The phone clattered beside her as 15 years of carefully constructed reality shattered like glass. Every conversation with Tom, every moment of comfort he'd provided, every gentle word about moving on and letting go, all of it had been manipulation. He'd been watching her, managing her, making sure she never dug too deep into Sarah's death. "You always were stronger than I gave you credit for, Maggie." Tom's voice echoed from the far end of the hallway. He stepped out of the shadows, still wearing his maintenance coveralls, still looking like the gentle man who'd saved her from alcoholism and despair. But now she could see what had always been there, the cold calculation in his eyes, the predatory way he moved. 30 years I've worked at this school, he continued, walking slowly toward her. 30 years of watching rich kids throw away opportunities while my own son got rejected for scholarships he deserved. Do you know what it's like to clean up after entitled brats while your own family struggles? Margaret forced herself to stand. So you stole from the scholarship fund. We redistributed resources. Hayworth needed money for his gambling debts. The donors needed tax write-offs for fictional students, and I needed justice for families like mine. Sarah was going to destroy a system that actually helped people. She was 18 years old. She was a threat. Tom's voice hardened. Just like you've become. Margaret looked at her phone on the floor between them. The video was still playing. She could see the timestamp ticking toward the moment when the fire would start. But something else caught her attention. In the corner of the frame, partially hidden behind Sarah's dresser, was another camera, a second angle. Sarah had been recording too. You never found her camera, Margaret said, understanding flooding through her. That's what you've been looking for all these years. That's why you stayed close to me. You thought she'd hidden evidence somewhere and I might lead you to it. Tom's expression shifted, and for the first time, she saw fear in his eyes. Where is it, Maggie? Where did she hide the camera? Margaret smiled, and it felt like the first genuine expression she'd worn in 15 years. I have no idea. But I know someone who might. She lunged for her phone. Tom's foot slammed down on Margaret's phone, the screen exploding into a spiderweb of fractured glass. She rolled away, her ribs screaming where his boot had grazed them, and scrambled toward the emergency stairwell at the far end of the hall. You can't run from this forever, Maggie. Tom's voice followed her, but she was already pushing through the heavy fire door. The stairwell was darker than the hallway, lit only by dim emergency bulbs that cast everything in sickly green. Her wet boots slipped on the metal steps as she climbed toward the third floor, toward Sarah's old room where this nightmare had started. She needed allies. She needed someone who could help her make sense of the video, someone who could identify the donors in Sarah's photograph. But everyone she'd trusted at Millfield was either dead, complicit, or hunting her through darkened hallways. The third-floor door opened into a corridor that felt like a mausoleum. Sarah's room was at the end, room 312, and Margaret found herself walking toward it like a condemned woman approaching the gallows. Behind her, she could hear Tom's footsteps on the stairs, steady and patient. He knew she had nowhere left to run. Room 312's door stood open. Inside, someone had recreated Sarah's dorm room exactly as it had been 15 years ago. The same furniture arrangement, the same textbooks stacked on the desk, even the same concert posters on the walls. It was a shrine built by a grieving mother's memory, but Margaret had never built it. I did this for you. Tom's voice came from directly behind her. She spun to find him filling the doorway, his maintenance coveralls replaced by an expensive suit she'd never seen him wear. Every year on Sarah's birthday, I'd set it up exactly like this. I thought someday you'd want to see it. You're insane. I'm practical. Do you know how many students have benefited from our scholarship redistribution over the years? Hundreds of working-class kids got chances they never would have had if we'd left the money with entitled brats like your daughter. Margaret backed toward the window, the same window Sarah would have used to escape if she'd been conscious. Sarah wasn't entitled. She worked for everything. She was going to destroy everything we built. The investigative journalism project she was working on. She had names, bank account numbers, donor records. She would have sent dozens of deserving scholarship recipients back to their dead-end lives just to satisfy her middle-class sense of morality. The photograph in Margaret's pocket felt like it was burning against her skin. Sarah's careful handwriting, trust no one in admin. Her daughter had known she was in danger, had been documenting everything, preparing for the worst. Where is her camera, Maggie? The video I showed you was from the hallway security feed, but Sarah was recording from inside the room. That footage would show everything. The injection, the accelerant, our faces. Insurance companies might not investigate accidents, but they sure as hell investigate murders. Margaret's mind raced. If Sarah had hidden a camera in this room, it would still be here. Tom wouldn't have dared to search too thoroughly while Margaret was around, wouldn't have risked drawing attention to this shrine he'd built. Her daughter had been brilliant, paranoid, thorough. Where would she hide something that important? The scholarship program was just the beginning, Tom continued, stepping further into the room. Do you know what Millfield's real business model is? Money laundering. International students paying tuition in cash, donor contributions that disappear into administrative costs, endowment investments that somehow lose millions every year. Sarah was going to expose a network that spans half the elite prep schools on the East Coast. Margaret's back hit the windowsill. Through the glass, she could see fire trucks in the parking lot, their lights spinning red and blue across the campus. Help was so close, but they thought she was already dead, buried somewhere in the wreckage of a heroic rescue attempt gone wrong. Your daughter recorded everything the night she died. She knew we were coming, but she was too drugged to do anything except lie there and document her own murder. Tom's smile was cold and terrible. Imagine watching yourself die in real time, knowing no one would ever see the evidence. But Margaret was imagining something else entirely. Sarah, brilliant and careful, would have known that hiding the camera in her room was useless if her killers had access to search it later. She would have put it somewhere they couldn't reach, somewhere only someone who truly knew her would think to look. The concert poster directly above Sarah's desk had always been slightly crooked. Margaret had noticed it every time she'd visited, had felt the tiny irritation of a mother wanting to straighten her daughter's belongings. But Sarah hated crooked things. She would never have left a poster hanging askew unless… Margaret lunged toward the desk. Tom moved to intercept her, but 15 years of guilt-driven fitness training had kept her strong, and desperation made her faster than she'd been in decades. Her fingers found the poster's edge, ripped it away from the wall. Behind it was a hole in the plaster, and inside that hole was a camera the size of a matchbox. Sarah's insurance policy, her final gift to her mother. Tom's roar of rage filled the room, but Margaret was already diving toward the window, camera clutched in her fist, ready to choose between justice and survival. Margaret's shoulder hit the window with enough force to spider the glass, but it didn't break. Tom's hands closed around her ankle, dragging her back into the room as she clawed desperately at the window frame. The camera, Sarah's camera, slipped from her grasp and skittered across the floor toward the bed. 15 years, Tom snarled, his grip tightening until Margaret felt bones grinding together. 15 years I've watched you stumble around this place like a broken ghost, and all you had to do was stay broken. Margaret twisted in his grip, her elbow connecting with his temple hard enough to make him stagger. She scrambled toward the camera, but Tom recovered faster than she'd expected. His boot caught her in the ribs, and she felt something crack. Do you want to know the worst part? Tom hauled her to her feet, his face inches from hers. Sarah called for you, right at the end when the drugs were wearing off and she could smell the smoke. She kept saying "Mama" over and over, thinking you were coming to save her. The words hit Margaret like physical blows. She'd wondered, God, how many nights had she wondered what Sarah's last moments were like? Now she knew, and the knowledge was worse than any nightmare she'd constructed in her grief-soaked imagination. She trusted you too, Margaret whispered, tasting blood. I remember her mentioning nice Tom from maintenance. You fixed her desk lamp once. I needed to know what she was working on. The journalism project was getting too close to our financial arrangements. Tom's voice carried no remorse, only irritation at having his carefully laid plans disrupted by an 18-year-old's moral compass. She was interviewing scholarship recipients, tracking where the money actually went. Smart girl, too smart. Margaret's eyes found the camera lying beneath Sarah's bed. Such a small thing to hold such devastating truth. But even if she could reach it, even if she could somehow escape this room alive, who would believe her? Tom had spent 15 years building a reputation as the kind, patient man who'd helped Margaret through her darkest period. Who would accept that he was actually her daughter's killer? You made me into this, she said, the realization crystallizing like ice in her chest. Every conversation about moving on, every gentle suggestion that I should stop blaming myself, you were making sure I never investigated. You were keeping me broken on purpose. Grief management is just another form of maintenance. Tom's smile was horrible in its sincerity. Buildings need repairs, people need adjustment. I'm good at both. Margaret thought of all the nights she'd sat in her office, staring at Sarah's photograph, and wondering if she could have prevented the fire. Tom would find her there sometimes, bring her coffee, listen to her catalog her failures as a mother. He'd encouraged her self-blame, fed it like kindling until it burned away everything else she might have been. The scholarship recipients Sarah had been interviewing, how many of them were real? How many were fictional students created to funnel money into offshore accounts? Margaret remembered Sarah's excitement about her journalism project, her determination to write something that mattered. She'd been investigating a story that could have destroyed careers, toppled administrations, sent people to prison. The expelled students, Margaret said. Tommy Brennan and his crew. You manipulated them too. Angry young men are so easy to aim. A few strategic conversations about injustice, some conveniently overheard phone calls about security weaknesses. They practically planned the attack themselves. They'll spend years in prison thinking they were rebels when they were really just tools. The fire trucks outside had gone silent. Either the emergency was over, or everyone thought Margaret was already dead in the flooded basement. Tom had probably called in reports of her heroic but futile rescue attempt, maybe even planted some evidence to support the story of her tragic demise. Margaret's ribs screamed as she straightened, but 15 years of carrying crushing guilt had taught her to function through pain. How many others? How many students died because they got too close to the truth? Sarah was the only one who needed to die. The others we just discouraged. Academic probation, disciplinary actions, parents convinced to transfer their children to other schools. Death is messy. It draws attention. But you enjoyed it. Margaret saw it now, the satisfaction in Tom's eyes when he talked about Sarah's final moments. You enjoyed watching her die. I enjoyed watching a problem solve itself. The casual cruelty of that statement, reducing Sarah's murder to a maintenance issue, broke something fundamental inside Margaret. The grief that had been her constant companion for 15 years transformed into something sharper, more useful. Rage burned through her like fire, and for the first time since Sarah's death, Margaret felt fully alive. She dove for the camera again, but this time it was a feint. As Tom moved to intercept her, she pivoted toward the window, her fist wrapped around Sarah's desk lamp. The same lamp Tom had fixed years ago to gain her daughter's trust. The lamp's base shattered the weakened glass completely, and Margaret felt the night air rush in as she prepared to show Tom Bradley exactly what a former fire chief looked like when she stopped apologizing for breathing. Tom's laughter cut through the night air like broken glass. You're going to jump? From the 3rd floor? His amusement was genuine, which somehow made it more chilling than his rage had been. Maggie, you've spent 15 years punishing yourself for failing to save Sarah. You really think you're going to start being heroic now? Margaret paused at the window frame, one foot on the sill, the camera clutched against her chest. The ground looked impossibly far away, but Tom's words hit deeper than her fear of falling. Because he was right, wasn't he? She'd failed Sarah when it mattered most. She'd failed to investigate her daughter's death. She'd failed to see through Tom's manipulation. She'd spent 15 years being exactly the broken woman he'd needed her to be. That's what I thought. Tom's voice carried the satisfaction of a man who understood people's weaknesses better than they understood themselves. You know what your real problem is, Maggie? You think you loved Sarah, but you only ever loved the idea of her, the perfect daughter who would validate your perfect mothering. Margaret's grip tightened on the camera. That's not true, isn't it? Sarah called you exactly twice her freshman year. Twice. She spent Christmas break with her roommate's family rather than come home to your suffocating guilt about the divorce. She was planning to transfer to Northwestern to get away from both you and this place. Tom stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. She didn't want to be saved by you, Maggie. She wanted to be free of you. The words landed like physical blows, each one finding the precise wounds Margaret had carried for 15 years. Sarah had been distant that freshman year. She had talked about transferring. She had seemed almost relieved to stay at school during breaks, claiming she was too busy with her journalism project to come home. Margaret had told herself it was normal teenage independence. But what if Tom was right? What if Sarah had been pulling away long before she died? What if Margaret had been mourning not just her daughter's death, but a relationship that was already broken? The night she died, Tom continued, "Do you know what Sarah's last words actually were? Not mama, not calling for you." His smile was surgical in its precision. She said, "I should have gone to Northwestern. I should have gotten away from all of this." Margaret's world tilted. The camera in her hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy, a burden she'd convinced herself she was strong enough to carry. Sarah hadn't wanted her protection. Sarah had been trying to escape, not just Millfield, not just the corruption she'd uncovered, but the whole suffocating weight of Margaret's love. "You see it now, don't you?" Tom's voice was almost gentle, the tone he'd used during all those late-night conversations when Margaret had poured out her guilt and self-recrimination. "You've been carrying 15 years of grief for someone who didn't even want you in her life. How does that feel?" Margaret looked down at the camera, at the evidence that could destroy Tom and expose the conspiracy that had killed her daughter. Justice was literally in her hands. But justice for whom? For a daughter who had died trying to get away from her? For a mother who had failed at the most basic requirement of parenthood, knowing what her child actually needed? The fire trucks below looked like toys. The parking lot seemed to swim in and out of focus as 15 years of carefully constructed meaning dissolved around her. She told herself that staying at Millfield, that carrying her guilt, that dedicating her life to preventing other fires was penance, atonement for her failures as a mother. But what if it had just been selfishness? What if she'd stayed because leaving would mean admitting that Sarah's life had moved beyond her sphere? What if all her grief and guilt and dedication had just been elaborate ways of making Sarah's death about herself? The scholarship fraud, the money laundering, that was wrong, Tom said, his voice reasonable and calm. But at least it served a purpose. Poor kids got opportunities. Working families got chances they never would have had otherwise. What purpose has your grief served, Maggie? Who has it helped besides your own need to feel important? Margaret's foot slipped on the windowsill. For a moment she teetered on the edge, the camera in her hands and Tom's words echoing in her skull. Below her, the world waited with the same indifferent gravity that had claimed so many of the people she'd failed to save over the years. But as she steadied herself against the window frame, something shifted in Margaret's peripheral vision. There, reflected in the broken glass, she caught sight of something that made her heart stop. Sarah's desk lamp, the one Tom claimed to have fixed, still had its original manufacturer's sticker on the base. The date code showed it had been manufactured 6 months after Sarah's death. Tom had lied about fixing Sarah's lamp. He'd lied about the small, intimate detail that was supposed to prove how well he'd known her daughter. If he'd lied about that, what else had he lied about? Margaret turned from the window slowly, the camera steady in her hands now. The date code on the lamp base burned in her vision like a beacon cutting through 15 years of carefully constructed lies. "You never fixed Sarah's lamp," she said quietly. Tom's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. "What?" "The lamp. You said you fixed it for her, that she thanked you, that it was one of those small interactions that proved how well you knew her." Margaret stepped down from the windowsill, her voice growing stronger. "But this lamp was manufactured 6 months after she died. You're confused. Grief does that to memory." "No." Margaret held up the lamp's base, angling it so the manufacturer's sticker caught the light. "March 2009. Sarah died in September 2008. You planted this lamp here, didn't you? When you were building your little shrine to my daughter." The silence stretched between them like a held breath. Through the broken window, Margaret could hear distant voices, emergency responders coordinating the search for bodies that didn't exist, looking for a tragedy that was orchestrated rather than accidental. "You've been lying about everything." The realization was spreading through Margaret's mind like warmth returning to frostbitten fingers. Sarah's last words, her wanting to transfer, her pulling away from me, all of it. Tom's composure finally cracked. "You don't understand the scope of what we were protecting." "We?" Margaret stepped closer, no longer afraid. "Who else? How many people at this school knew you murdered my daughter?" "It wasn't murder. It was damage control." Tom's hand moved toward his jacket pocket, but Margaret was already anticipating him. 15 years of survivor's guilt had taught her to read violence in the smallest gestures. She swung the lamp base in a wide arc, catching Tom's wrist as he drew what looked like a syringe from his pocket. The same drug cocktail he'd used on Sarah, she realized. The same method he'd planned to use on her before staging her death as a heroic accident. "How many others?" Margaret demanded, driving her knee toward Tom's solar plexus. "How many people have you killed to protect your money laundering operation?" Tom doubled over, but managed to keep hold of the syringe. "You have no idea what you're destroying. The scholarship program helped hundreds of kids by murdering anyone who threatened to expose it." Margaret grabbed his wrist, twisting until she heard bones crack. The syringe clattered across the floor toward Sarah's bed. "My daughter wasn't collateral damage. She was 18 years old, and you killed her for doing journalism. She was going to ruin everything." Tom's mask of reasoned calm finally shattered completely. 5 years of careful planning, thousands of dollars redirected to deserving students, and your precious daughter was going to destroy it all for a college newspaper article. Margaret felt something settle into place deep in her chest, not the crushing weight of guilt she'd carried for 15 years, but something solid and unbreakable. Purpose. She was doing her job. She was trying to expose corruption. She was naive and privileged and couldn't understand the bigger picture. She was right. Margaret drove her elbow into Tom's temple, sending him staggering toward the door. "And you killed her for it." Tom recovered his balance and lunged toward the syringe, but Margaret was already moving. She kicked the syringe away and positioned herself between Tom and the door. He was trapped now, with nowhere to go except through her or out the third-story window. "The fire tonight," Margaret said, pieces clicking together with crystalline clarity. "You orchestrated it to destroy evidence." Sarah's camera was just one piece of what she'd collected, wasn't it? The financial records, the donor lists, the scholarship applications. She had enough documentation to bring down administrators at a dozen schools. Tom wiped blood from his mouth, his eyes darting around the room for weapons or escape routes. "Her death bought us 15 years of continued operations. Do you know how many working-class kids got college educations because of that sacrifice? It wasn't her sacrifice to make. You took that choice away from her." Margaret thought of all the nights she'd sat in her security office, staring at Sarah's photograph and wondering if her daughter had been afraid in those final moments. Now she knew the truth was worse than fear. Sarah had been documenting her own murder, fighting until the very end to ensure justice would eventually find its way to the surface. The expelled students, Tommy Brennan and the others. They really think they're burning down the school for revenge, don't they? Margaret moved closer to Tom, backing him toward the broken window. "They have no idea they're just covering up your crimes. Sometimes the greater good requires—" "There is no greater good in murdering children." Margaret's voice carried 15 years of suppressed rage, but for the first time since Sarah's death, the rage felt clean, righteous, useful. "And you're going to confess to every single one of your crimes before this night is over." Tom glanced toward the window, calculating distances and odds of survival. Margaret smiled, and it was not a kind expression. "Jump if you want, but you're not taking any more secrets with you." Tom's eyes narrowed as he processed Margaret's words. For 15 years, he'd been the architect of her grief, carefully constructing each conversation to keep her focused on self-blame rather than investigation. Now that control was slipping through his fingers like smoke. "You think you have it all figured out," he said, wiping more blood from his split lip. "But you're still the same broken woman who couldn't save her own daughter." Margaret felt the familiar stab of guilt, conditioned response after years of psychological manipulation. But this time, something else rose to meet it. The image of Sarah's camera, hidden beneath her bed for 15 years, waiting for someone to care enough to look. "Sarah didn't die because I failed her," Margaret said, each word precise and deliberate. "She died because you murdered her, and you've spent 15 years making sure I was too destroyed to see it." Tom's hand moved toward his pocket again, but Margaret was ready. She grabbed the broken lamp cord, its copper wires exposed like tiny claws. How many others knew? The headmaster? The board of trustees? "Just me and Wilson." The money had to flow through proper channels, but he never asked questions about the details. Tom's voice carried the pride of a craftsman discussing his work. "We built something beautiful, Maggie. A system that actually helped kids instead of just helping rich families buy their way into better schools, by stealing from legitimate scholarships, by redirecting funds that would have gone to children who already had advantages." Tom stepped sideways, trying to angle toward the door, but Margaret mirrored his movement. Sarah's investigation would have destroyed everything. Hundreds of working-class students would have lost their educations. Was one privileged girl's life really worth that much? The casual dismissal of Sarah's worth, reducing her to nothing more than an obstacle to be removed, broke the last chains that had bound Margaret to her guilt. Her daughter hadn't been perfect, hadn't been the ideal child Margaret had sometimes imagined in her grief. But Sarah had been brave enough to investigate corruption, determined enough to document evidence, and principled enough to risk her own safety for the truth. "You know what Sarah's real last words were?" Margaret said, advancing on Tom with a broken lamp cord in her hands. "I listened to the recording. She said, 'Someone needs to know what really happened here.' She wasn't trying to escape me. She was trying to protect other students from you." Tom's composure cracked further. That recording was destroyed in the fire. The recording on her camera was damaged, but the backup files on her laptop were just corrupted, not destroyed. Margaret smiled, and this time it was genuinely warm. "I had a friend in digital forensics recover them last month. Every interview, every financial document, every piece of evidence she'd collected. I've been sitting on it all, wondering what to do with it." The lie came so naturally that Margaret almost believed it herself, but it had the desired effect. Tom's face went pale as he processed the implications. If Sarah's investigation had survived, if the evidence was still intact, that's impossible. "I checked her room after the fire. There was nothing left. You checked the obvious places. You never thought to look in the coffee can she kept in the laundry room, did you?" Sarah was smart enough to hide her real evidence somewhere you'd never think to search. Tom's breathing became rapid and shallow. 15 years of security, of knowing he'd successfully covered his tracks, was disintegrating around him. "You're lying." Margaret pulled out her cell phone, scrolling to a contact she'd programmed months ago but never called. Detective Amanda Reeves, the investigator who'd been quietly building a case against financial corruption in private schools. "Want me to call her? She's been very interested in reopening certain cold cases involving student deaths." "Wait." Tom held up his hands, his voice losing all its earlier confidence. "We can work something out. The money, we can trace where it went, prove that it actually helped people. You could be part of something meaningful instead of just this." "This?" Margaret gestured around Sarah's preserved room, at the evidence of a life cut short and a mother's 15-year journey toward the truth. "This is me finally being the parent Sarah needed. This is me finishing what she started." Tom made one final desperate lunge toward the door, but Margaret was ready for him. The lamp cord wrapped around his ankle, sending him sprawling across Sarah's desk. As he fell, his hand knocked over a framed photograph. Sarah, at her high school graduation, smiling with the confidence of someone who believed she could change the world. The photo hit the floor but didn't break. The glass spiderweb cracked but held, just like Margaret had. Damaged but not destroyed. Scarred but still capable of reflection. "You're going to confess," Margaret said, standing over Tom as he struggled to untangle himself from the cord. "To the police, to the families of every student whose money you stole, to everyone whose lives you've destroyed." Starting now, she pressed the call button and listened to it ring. Sarah's camera clutched against her heart like a promise finally kept. The phone rang 3 times before Detective Reeves answered, her voice crisp despite the late hour. "Reeves. Detective, this is Margaret Cross at Millfield Academy. I have Tom Wilson here, and he's ready to confess to the murder of my daughter Sarah Cross 15 years ago." The words felt strange in Margaret's mouth. Not heavy as she'd expected, but light, like releasing a breath she'd been holding for too long. Tom struggled beneath the lamp cord, his face flushed with rage and panic, but the fight had gone out of him. He knew, as Margaret had known for so many years, that some truths were too large to contain once they began spilling into the light. "Are you in immediate danger, Miss Cross?" Detective Reeves's voice sharpened with professional alertness. "No, he's secured." "But Detective," Margaret looked down at Tom, this man who had shaped 15 years of her life through careful manipulation and lies. "Bring backup, and someone from financial crimes. This goes much deeper than one murder." 20 minutes later, the dormitory hallway filled with the measured footsteps of investigators. Margaret had spent the time sitting on Sarah's bed, still holding the camera, while Tom alternated between bitter silence and desperate attempts to negotiate his way out of consequences that had finally caught up with him. She'd stopped listening to his words. Instead, she found herself remembering Sarah at 7, insisting on interviewing the mail carrier for her elementary school newspaper. Sarah at 14, writing an exposé on the cafeteria's food waste that led to a recycling program. Sarah at 17, calling her mother from her dorm room, excited about a journalism scholarship she was applying for. "I want to make a difference, Mama," Sarah had said that night, her voice crackling through the phone connection. "There's so much that needs fixing in the world." Margaret had worried then that her daughter was too idealistic, too willing to believe she could change systems that had been broken for decades. Now she understood that Sarah's idealism hadn't been naivety, it had been courage. Detective Reeves entered the room first, a compact woman with graying hair and eyes that took in every detail with practiced efficiency. Behind her came 2 uniformed officers and a man Margaret recognized from news reports about corporate investigations. "Mr. Wilson," Detective Reeves said, approaching Tom with careful deliberation. "You've been advised of your rights?" "I want a lawyer," Tom said immediately. "That's your right. But Miss Cross mentioned you were ready to make a statement." Margaret stood up slowly, her joints protesting after the night's events. Through Sarah's window, she could see fire trucks still positioned around the building, their lights painting the campus in alternating red and blue. The fake emergency Tom had orchestrated to destroy evidence had instead led to his capture. There was something satisfying about that irony. "The evidence of the financial fraud is in his office," Margaret said to Detective Reeves. "Sarah documented everything before he killed her. Bank records, scholarship applications, correspondence with other schools running similar schemes. Alleged," Tom's lawyer would eventually say. But Margaret had seen the truth in his eyes when she'd mentioned Sarah's hidden evidence, the specific fear of a guilty man whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. 3 hours later, Margaret sat in the security office she'd occupied for 15 years, watching the sun rise over Millfield Academy. The building would need extensive repairs from the fire damage, cosmetic mostly, since the emergency response teams had contained the flames quickly. But the real damage, the institutional rot that had festered for decades, was finally being exposed to light. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Linda, who'd seen the news reports. "Coming to get you. Pack a bag. You're staying with us until this settles." Margaret smiled, thinking of Linda's guest room with its clean white walls and complete absence of the past 15 years' accumulated grief. For the first time since Sarah's death, the idea of leaving this place didn't feel like abandonment. She picked up Sarah's camera one last time, running her fingers over its worn edges. The evidence it contained would help convict Tom Wilson and expose the corruption that had killed her daughter. Justice, finally, after 15 years of misdirected guilt. But more than that, the camera represented something Margaret had forgotten she was capable of, the ability to move forward without leaving love behind. She placed the camera carefully in an evidence bag for Detective Reeves, then walked to her desk and began clearing out 15 years of accumulated vigil. Family photos, commendation letters, the small shrine to permanence she'd built around her grief. As she packed, Margaret found herself humming something she hadn't thought of in years, a lullaby she used to sing to Sarah when her daughter was small and the world still seemed manageable. Outside her window, Millfield Academy continued its morning routines, but everything had changed. The truth, like fire, had a way of transforming everything it touched. Margaret shouldered her bag and walked toward whatever came next, carrying her daughter's memory not as a burden, but as a light.